Welcome to today's lecture. My name is Dr. Kagin. I'm the director of the center. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to invite you all to take a look at upcoming events. Fairly closely related to today's topic. We'll have another lecture coming up on November 5th, Election Day. Wow. By our own postdoctoral fellow, Hazal Özdemir, titled The Vow Never to Return, Armenian Transatlantic Mobility and Abandoned Ottomans. So there's a sort of immediate parallel connection to passports here. And then later the same week, on November 7th, we'll have Thomas Simsarian Dolan from the Armenian General Benevolent Union speaking to us about making MENA, as the acronym for Middle East and North Africa, histories of the Middle East, race, and the U.S. Census. Both of those will take place at 4 p.m. in this room here. Please also, these are advertised on our website. We have the flyers out there with further programming coming up. And now let me turn to today's event. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. İlkay Yilmaz, who's a researcher at the Friedrich Meinecke Institute in Berlin, at part of the Freie Universität, where she works in the section for modern history. Previously, she's been a research fellow at the Forum for Transregional Studies in their Europe and the Middle East, the Middle East and Europe program, and a fellow at the Leibniz-Zentrum, all in Berlin. She had a PhD from Istanbul University, and has also taught there until she was forced to leave that position due to political pressure. And in that sense, it's almost apt that she has studied securitization, policing, surveillance, and things like that. The focus of her research is on the late Ottoman Empire rather than the present. But I also noticed that you have written a fairly extensive book chapter on the Republican security apparatus as well, which I didn't think that was a topic to do. So I was very intrigued to see that. But in her research, that's also going to be the basis for today's talk. Dr. Yilmaz investigates means of information and control, maps, permits, registrations, passports, this paperwork that the state puts in place when it sees mobility as a major threat to a fragile and fragmented state. And so this securitization is in many ways directed at travelers and visitors, so at nomads, and it targets political dissent on the imperial or national or in the international scale as well. And as you can imagine, in the Ottoman context, this was the Armenian population as a group with a lot of dissent and satisfaction with the empire would be targeted as well. So, and as I said, she also shows that this system of surveillance and mobility restriction is not an Ottoman specialty, but sort of links up to a more international system that specifically also targets or serves the persecution of anarchist movements around the world at that time. Dr. Yilmaz has published extensively on this. There's many articles and book chapters. There's her first book 10 years ago, with the title translated into English, Pursuit of Vagrant, Anarchist, and Conspirator, Internal Passports, Passports, and Hotel Registers for the Security Policies during the Abdülhamid II era. This came out from Tarih Vakfı Yurt Yayınları in Istanbul in 2014. And last year, she published a big monograph that you see here in front of us, Ottoman Passports, Security, and Geographical Mobility, from Syracuse University Press. We have the flyers out here, and there is a QR code on the back where you can purchase the book with a 40% discount. So take advantage of it. I would be remiss before I turn the podium over to her to have thanked our partners in this enterprise. So Dr. Yilmaz is actually touring the United States and various of our partner centers. She's going to go on to Berkeley, San Francisco, Fresno State, and UCLA. I'm not sure that's a full list, but whoever has partnered with us in making this trip possible, thank you all. And we're happy to have you here. And welcome to the podium. Please join me in round of applause. Okay. Now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to present my book. And actually, I didn't expect that it would be that crowded. So thank you for coming. So yeah, my book, it's the Ottoman Passport, Security and Geographic Mobility from the Berlin Treaty until the Constitutional Revolution in the Ottoman Empire. So in this book, I try to write about controlling the geographical mobility, anti-anarchism, infrastructural power and structural violence, the Ottoman administrative network, and also criminalization of Armenians, Bulgarians, seasonal workers, and political activists. So nearly 115 years ago, a 30-year-old Armenian woman named Margaret and her 12-year-old daughter Aznef from the town of Çardak Karahisari Sharki in Sivas were given permission to leave for North America on the condition of no return to the Ottoman Empire. The internal passports, which were required for travel within the empire and could also be used as identity documents in practice, were confiscated, and their international passports were inscribed with the sentence, quote, "No return to the Ottoman Empire henceforth," end quote. They were registered for immigration to America, which also meant the deprivation of their citizenship according to a decree aimed at Armenians. Their photographs were filed at the local police station and circulated to the Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The main reason for those bureaucratic regulations was that the Ottoman government suspected every Armenian who migrated to North America as a potential revolutionary, a conspirator against the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, that the Ottoman government deprived Armenians who migrated to North America after 1896 of their citizenship rights. Armenians with US passports were not allowed to re-enter the Ottoman Empire. Margaret and Aznef were also the target of those regulations. Unlikely though it seems, Margaret and Aznef's file was closely related to an event that shook another empire, the assassination of Empress Elizabeth of Austria-Hungary on September 10, 1898. The assassination of Sisi was part of the wave of assassination attempts against the members of dynasty, high-ranking bureaucrats, and bourgeoisie starting from Russia, Italy, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Spain, France, Iran, Belgium, and even branching out to the US became a phenomenon during the era. The anarchist thinkers proposed the concept of propaganda by deed and the use of terror techniques as propaganda. Propaganda by deed or direct action is predicted or was predicted on the idea that masses may only be stirred up and awareness can be raised through practicing propaganda by deed, as the impact of mass meetings, daily newspapers, declarations were limited in as much as manipulated by bourgeoisie. They ignored and looked upon demands and motions of the lower classes, and the political oppression constitute legitimate base for the acts of violence. In the wake of this assassination by the Italian anarchist Luigi Luceni, the Italian government hosted the International Conference in Rome for the defense against anarchists. This conference was one of the first inter-imperial collaborations or trans-imperial collaborations that led to the founding of today's Interpol. The conference discussed how to define anarchists and anarchist acts, as well as the contemporary methods of policing, surveillance, and extradition. Passport technologies and practices were important for knowledge exchange on controlling geographical mobility and for inter-imperial information sharing as part of gathering intelligence on suspects. The bureaucratic infrastructure of passport practices was later standardized internationally. This historical turn also affected Ottoman passport practices. The Ottoman Empire was one of the first states to actively use the new technologies of filing, registering, and circulating intelligence, which also involved the use of photographs even before the conference. The book reconsiders the history of two political issues, namely the Armenian and Macedonian questions, and investigates how the Hamidian government tried to improve the capacity of the state to create knowledge of the Ottoman population and to implement political decisions throughout the realm with its administrative infrastructure. I analyzed two problems together, allowing me to draw on both the history of mobility restrictions and state control. These included regulations on passports and internal travel permit systems within the context of a fast expanding Ottoman police state. This book provides a global institutional history of mobility restrictions and state documentation and other security practices, analyzing travel regulations and other security practices within the context of a tumultuous late Ottoman political climate. It explores the Ottoman government's mobility restrictions as part of the government's attempt to collaborate with joint European security efforts to form an inter-imperial criminal justice network against anarchism. The International Conference of Rome, in the conference and in a later conference in St. Petersburg, significant issues that were raised include keeping records, setting up institutions for the surveillance of suspected individuals, as well as the use of passports and travel permits. The Ottoman Empire was one of the participant governments in these conferences, which were the first international attempts to create an international police cooperation. The new constellations of the Ottoman passport practices were part of the everyday politics of security and can only be examined by placing them in the context of the Armenian and Macedonian questions, both of which took place in the frontier regions of the empire and anti-anarchism during the late Ottoman Empire. This book explores how mobility restrictions became critical to targeting groups including Armenians, Bulgarians, seasonal and foreign workers, and revolutionaries. The aim of the book is threefold. First, it investigates the international and internal security aspects of the Armenian and Macedonian questions in the late Ottoman period. It analyzes how these two important political topics became issues of security for the Ottoman government. In doing so, this book discusses the different political demands, not only from the political elites in Bulgarian and Armenian communities, but also from revolutionaries as internal dimensions in the Ottoman domestic political context. It further examines how international political conflicts affected the Ottoman government's approach to these political issues. Macedonia and Eastern Anatolia, or Armenia, or Kurdistan, were marked by interstate competition, massacres, paramilitary violence, as well as extra-legal state violence. Instead of analyzing the two regions with regional exceptionalism, this book examines these frontier regions as part of the debates on state formation and addresses mobility controls in these regulations in the discussions of control over territory and people. Second, it explores the violent tactics of revolutionaries and anarchists, as well as the international police cooperation that rose against such violence. Acts of terror, I'm using terror because back then, the anarchists themselves, they were using this concept, not the states. So acts of terror became potent propaganda tools, and the Ottoman government responded with force, drawing on old and new security concepts to legitimize its newly oppressive tactics. The Ottoman government also joined on international security collaborations against anarchism, as it sought to crack down on the overlapping categories of working class foreigners, Armenians, and Bulgarians. And third, the book takes up the official discourse surrounding mobility restrictions. So they were mostly using those three terms: fesat, conspirator or mischief, serseri, vagrant, and anarchist. So they were using them mostly together, as well as how they played out in practice, these discourses, and comparing both to those being enacted in rival empires across Europe. In this way, the book situates the Ottomans within global debates on migration, control over geographical mobility, and police collaboration that arose in the late 19th century. Taking up these new policies on surveillance, mobility, and control offers a timely look at the origins of contemporary migration debates and the historical development of terrorism and counterterrorism. Amidst the radical movements that opposed the period of Sultan Abdülhamit II, questions of mobility haunted Ottoman elites who searched for new security tools to exert state control. Here, the book deploys mobility to refer not only to emigration or immigration, but also all kinds of movements, whether voluntary travel or forced displacement. The government grew more and more suspicious of particular classes of Bulgarians and Armenians, particularly those who were seasonal or trans-imperial workers. These and other imperial subjects were deemed threats as potential revolutionaries and member of secret societies. In this way, the government developed suspicions about the Armenian poor and Bulgarians, quote, who might join revolutionary circles, end quote. This book investigates the Ottoman methods of control during this period and asks three main questions. What was the political context that shaped Ottoman security policies on geographical mobility? Which discursive traditions did authorities draw on to define suspects, and how did they craft discourses to cast these groups as serious threats? Moreover, which mobility restrictions were enacted, and how did these measures play out in practice? To answer these questions, this book investigates not a specific region, but a certain set of practices. This work further draws on critical security studies, critical theories of power, and historical sociology, and includes theories of modern state formation. So this book has two main arguments. First, the regime's attempts at controlling mobility were directly connected to the legitimacy crisis of the central government, rising radical opposition, the increasing use of violence as revolutionary propaganda sometimes, and the loss of territories during the age of high imperialism. Second, mobility restrictions provide a useful indicator of this regime's power and a means for tracing long-term changes in the Ottoman administrative practices. During the late 19th century, the Ottoman government came under the influence of its imperial rivals, the European great powers, and the Ottoman government started to conceptualize its own internal problems with reference to European and Russian colonial expansion, especially after the Treaty of Berlin. As a result, it targeted internal threats to the regime with new security policies that created new categories of suspects. This process also produced a new regime of internal passports aimed at controlling the state's newly defined internal enemies. Sovereignty, modern power, and security created new versions of marginalities and criminalization of certain groups, and helped the state define new classes of subjects. These marginalities were usually attached to an ethnic and sometimes class identity, which can be traced in Ottoman passport practices. Challenges to that sovereignty gave rise to new attempts to restrict mobility. By building on these concepts, This book claims that the intersections of sovereignty, modern power, and security can be discussed via passport policies during the late Ottoman Empire. The passport regulations and internal passport regulation of 1887 provides us with important insights into the ways the state positioned itself in relation with the Ottoman society and how the state perceives the foreigners who enter the Ottoman Empire. Passport controls were mainly registered in police documents when exercised on persons who were identified as threat elements. Most of the archival documents deal with internal passport controls, mainly on the seasonal workers, arrivals and departures from Istanbul. Nonetheless, in the Hamidian era, precisely the Armenian seasonal workers, mostly porters, coachmen, construction workers, and firefighters were regarded as the potential vagrants, conspirators, seditious people, or mischiefs, and anarchists because of the political mobilization of Armenians. In the Hamidian era, the fear of political mobilization of lower classes by the means of nationalisms or anarchism was attached with the fear of violent acts like bomb attacks or assassination attempts. This conjuncture is evident in relevance to the internal passport checks to control the traffic of Istanbul, which was practiced as a preventive mechanism against political actions from the point of view of the political elites. So using these documents allowed me to connect two histories, Macedonian and Armenian questions, and open the discussion that argues the relation between the security definitions, mechanisms that paved the way to control the geographical mobility, and their effects on how the Ottoman government defined its internal enemies. So now I want to talk a little bit about the Armenian case. Through the passport regulations. So one of the most important questions in the era was who can take a passport or an internal passport. Although the central authorities were accurate about eliminating the illegal conditions on passport practices or not to issue passports to the people without the necessary qualifications, it's obvious that there were lots of problems concerning on these all subjects. People whose entrances were forbidden could not receive internal passports from the authorities. However, the nodal point of this issue was that the internal passport code was not enough to identify acceptable holders according to the state elites. Thus, there were lots of correspondences between the administrative offices about the practice of the regulation, mostly after the political demonstrations or massacres or actions of propaganda by the The general pattern in internal passport controls was the restrictions of the travel to the capital city, Istanbul, or Dersaadet, considering the fear of a potential rebellion was central to the threat perception of the political elites. Thus, the control on arrivals or departures to and from Istanbul was one of the most significant questions in the archival documents, especially after the political actions. The controls in the ports on people heading to Istanbul seems also important. One of the significant issues for the government was that all the passengers without internal passports must be arrested and treated according to the internal passport code. In September 1894, many people, mostly porters and day laborers, came to Istanbul from the eastern provinces. This was the year of a big famine, actually. The biggest port, Trabzon was the biggest port, still is the biggest port in the Black Sea coast to head for Istanbul. Since there was a high possibility, from the point of view of the political elites, there was a high possibility that some of them were Armenians, the central authorities ordered to prevent even their arrival to Trabzon, and that they should have been sent back to their homes. Another document about the same case mentioned that most of them had no internal passports or identity cards to travel, so they were regarded as suspects. Because they had no orderly travel documents, their entrance could not be allowed to Trabzon, and if some of them managed to arrive in Istanbul, immediately they had to get deported to their homes. If there had been any passengers without orderly documents or vagrants in the ferries coming from Trabzon, their departure port staff would have been investigated. So all the local administrations and ports through the Black Sea coast were acknowledged about this issue by telegrams and were advised to send these kind of people back to their homes or to Trabzon. The decree about not to issue internal passports to suspects and seditious people was one of the essential measures to eliminate the entrances to Istanbul from the other ports of the Ottoman Empire by vagrants in 1896. In 1888, a little bit earlier, the Ottoman government banned immigration to the United States. The US government announced that it had little use for more labor migration, and the Ottoman government's decision to prevent those wishing to go to America was communicated to the provinces on March 1888. At this time, a group of 70 Armenians from Harput had come to Istanbul with the aim of finding factory work in the United States, but their migration was prevented. They were returned to their homelands at the government's cost. The related document stated that after the point, passports would not be issued to those with questionable seditious aims, wishing to go to the United States or another country to find a work. The notification from the US that it no longer needed labor was not based on the perception of a political threat, actually. Yet the Ottoman statelets operated based on primarily on their own security concerns and saw geographical mobility tied to labor migration as related to the revolutionary Armenians' illegitimate political aims. So the Armenians continued to travel to North America, though mainly via smuggling networks, and the Ottoman government tried to continue surveillance of quote, suspicious Armenians, end quote, simply because of the impossibility of performing routine controls over every Armenian aiming to travel on foreign ships. Another factor in prohibiting immigration to the United States was the bilateral agreement between that country and the Ottoman Empire, which, in its English version, granted impunity to American citizens from arrest and Ottoman jurisdiction. Because the Ottoman government's main concern here was the possibility of a conspiracy by revolutionary Armenian Americans who could travel back to the Ottoman Empire, the prohibition remained in place until 1896. So according to the nationality law, the Ottoman nationality law of 1869, quote, only the central authorities can dispense the permission to expatriate under the Article 5 and order the banishment or expulsion of those who expatriate without permission, end quote. The Ottoman Armenians who gained US citizenship without permission from the Ottoman government were still Ottoman citizens under this law, and the Ottoman government claimed just jurisdiction rights over them. On the advice of Ministry of Police, the police minister Hüseyin Nazım Pasha, the Wazirate, the prime ministry, decided to use this law and the passport regulations, and Armenians who left for the Ottoman states without having their documents in order were labeled as fugitives, firari, in the Ottoman legal framework. Even if these Armenians returned to the Ottoman Empire with orderly US passports, their entry would be strictly prohibited, and if they somehow entered anyway, they were considered as fugitives. Moreover, if they traveled to the Ottoman Empire by ship, they were to be deported back to the US on the very same ship. The Ottoman government made another administrative regulation that added further complexity to passport practices toward Armenian immigrants. Gaining US citizenship would deprive them of their property and inheritance rights in the Ottoman Empire. If Armenians wished to retain their rights, they would have to expatriate from the US and reclaim their status as Ottoman citizens. In 1896, the Ottoman government issued a letter of undertaking for Armenians who wanted to migrate to the United States. Armenians who signed the document declared that they would never return to the empire and filed 2 photographs with the document. In return, they were issued a travel document, usually an internal passport, not an international passport. After the massacres of 1894-96, many Armenians applied to leave the empire for the United States. However, even if they had all the documents required, the passport officers in Harput asked them, quote, if they had rebelled against the Ottoman state, end quote. And this question was enough to frighten the applicants. In addition to other documents, emigrating Armenians were also responsible for providing photographs, as I mentioned before, but the standards of these photographs were not regulated. Most of the ones in the Ottoman archives were like family portraits of the time. Considering the limited number of photographers with equipment, So considering the limited number of photographers with equipment, obtaining photographs was not always easy. This was the case in Harput, the place from which many Armenians migrated to North America. According to the British consul there, the only photographer in Harput had no glasses and could not take photographs. This problem was solved with the involvement of the British consulate, but it took months to get the lenses from London. The filing of those photographs was a new administrative procedure for the Ottoman bureaucracy. According to a later Ministry of Internal Affairs decision, 12 copies of each photograph, which is too much, with payments for more than 2 photographs made from the ministry's budget, were supposed to be taken and held by the port commissions. Some administrative centers had freelance photographers, and in some police stations, officers were trained to take photographs. Those photographs were supposed to be circulated to different Ottoman ports and police stations. If the photographs did not arrive at the port commissions in time, Armenians who applied to leave for North America had to stay at the port under surveillance until the photos were delivered. These requirements created another form of victimization. In 1906, a group of 12 Armenian women and their children had to wait more than 6 weeks in Trabzon until their photographs were delivered to the port administration. Although the governor of Trabzon and the British consul in Trabzon tried to solve the problem on their behalf, the regulation was strictly adhered to without any exception, and they had to stay in the port for 6 weeks. Restrictions on Armenian mobility were aimed not only at those seeking to immigrate to North America. For instance, a group of Armenians from Mush, who had been in Galosh, most probably Cluj in Romania, for a number of years, and who wished to return to their homelands without passing through Istanbul, were refused passports on the grounds of a ban on the return of Armenians. Because of a general pardon of Armenians after the Memorandum of 1895, the Ottoman government decided that visas would not be granted to returnees who were declared to be anarchists or seditious, whereas the entry of all others was to be facilitated. To prevent the return of Armenians who had left the Ottoman Empire for foreign countries under instructions never to return, their identity documents were seized and a note was added to their passports. The authorities to do so rested with provinces and port commissions, who were obliged to share the information with the Population Registration Office. The internal passports of emigrating Armenians were inscribed, quote, henceforth not to return to the Ottoman Empire, end quote. The port commission was to keep a file on such individuals, as was the Armenian Patriarchate. Armenians who left the country with orderly documents and who wished to return would not be granted passports. Meanwhile, the right to obtain passports was withdrawn from Armenians who had gone abroad without registering or through illegal means or as exiles or fugitives, even though they were Ottoman citizens. The denial of passports to Armenians who wished to travel to Iran also points to how the empire determined where certain of its subjects could and could not go. The phrasing of notions in formal documents ensured clear communication between bureaucratic offices. Although notations in such documents also used phrases not found in any regulation, and the transformation of each of these documents into a source of intelligence rendered apparent the administrative network. The notations on passports stated such things as henceforth not to return to the Ottoman Empire. In some instances, red ink was used, which meant the holder of the passport was a suspect, or codes were used to indicate the holder was considered seditious. In some passports, they were putting an Ottoman F, an Arabic F in the passport as a reference to Fesad, the mischief or the conspirator or the seditious. So these unusual administrative acts were formed within the security policies of the Ottoman government. Practices related to travel documents took shape in terms of the perception of threat. Alongside the administrative network, they served to spread symbolic violence within society. During and after the massacres of 1894-96, numerous Armenians left the country mostly for Europe and Russia, and were prohibited from returning. with the Ottoman government's resistance to the reform program under the Berlin Treaty, France, Russia, and Great Britain sent the Memorandum of 1895 to the Ottoman government concerning the Armenian community basically in the eastern provinces. So on October 20, the Ottoman government responded by saying it would prepare a reform scheme responding to international pressure. Sultan Abdülhamit II declared an amnesty that permitted Armenians to return back to the empire between December 9 and 19 in 1896. The file about this amnesty shows some interesting cases and correspondences. So on the just after 19th of December, 20th of December, 25 Armenians came with a Georgian ferry, but the police did not let them land because it was the end of the amnesty, and it created like a further issue. So it was obvious that they got their travel documents from the consulate before 9th of December, as soon as they were informed about the amnesty. In the result of the police investigation, the commission, which was responsible to control and investigate the Armenians with the intention to emigrate, declared that these Armenians were not suspects. They had the orderly travel documents by 9 December, and it was decided by the police authorities to release these people for quote, good behavior by the condition of having a guarantor, end quote. The information based on the intelligence services about lots of Armenians coming by Georgian ferries and the presence of conspirators among them caused the decision of preventing all these people landing. Against the ferry company's attempt to land them, the state authorities ordered to Varna and Constanta consulates not to give internal and international passports, which could be used by those Armenians who were not allowed to enter the empire. They were coming from Istanbul. They were coming to Istanbul from Odessa, Varna, Marseille, etc. All those ports from the Black Sea and also the Mediterranean. And the police minister asked to the office of the prime minister what to do about those people and the people who would continue to come because they were coming and they were trapped in the ships in the sea. And it was very interesting that the police administration had the intelligence before they came to the empire, even if they did not have the registered documents. So the intelligence network was working quite well. The prediction of the police minister, Hüseyin Nazım Pasha, was true. One day after his correspondence, there were 4 more ships full of Armenian passengers, and again, they were not allowed to land. So there were a lot of intelligence reports. And then there was this decision, the officers should have identified the exceptions who were not members of revolutionary committees. So according to the Ottoman government, the Ottoman authorities, actually every ordinary Armenian was a revolutionary, but only the exceptions were not, revolutionaries. Considering the European consulate's objections about the Armenian policy, of course, of the Ottoman Empire, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs advised an extension of the deadline of the amnesty. And finally, the amnesty extended for 75 more days, and the procedure about the passengers was clarified. The passengers would be kept under custody, and the unsuspect ones, the exceptions, from Istanbul would be released with a surety, with a guarantor, which was going to be registered in the Patriarchate. The Armenian passengers from other places would be sent back to their villages. The criminals would be punished. However, the number of Armenians was so high that a special commission was founded for their political investigation of their political belonging. Another problematic issue in this file was the deportations of the revolutionaries and the investigations about the reasons of their geographical mobilization. Another practice in the ports was about to prevent the arrivals of the unwanted foreigners. I think I'm going a bit, I'm just passing this. So, in the book, by drawing on the correspondences between the ranks of imperial and local bureaucracy, I tried to provide an account of the legal and administrative structures, regulations, and practices. Likewise, the Ottoman bureaucracy created a narrative that connected that connected these practices and regulations. And they created a narrative that connected the Ottoman security policies to the contemporary international policy collaboration via anti-anarchism. In addition to internal political decisions, this book also offers an elaborated look into understanding how Ottoman security perceptions and travel regulations were directly linked to transnational security regimes, which can be analyzed through cross-border security policies, practices, discourses, and legal norms. The dynamic relations between security and sovereignty paves the way to discuss the security institutions, norms and techniques and practices with a reference to state formation. A critical reading of this dynamic relation also highlights the normalization of security practices and the normalization in the suppression of internal threats, which were defined by the governments or political elites. This book argues that to intensify the surveillance as part of criminal policing, the Ottoman government also started to employ modern scientific methods of identification and further conducted investigations of suspect foreigners and Ottoman groups. However, instead of only using brand new techniques, the Ottoman Empire used these new surveillance technologies with old administrative and social control mechanisms, which had evolved throughout the centuries. The old and new surveillance mechanisms and their practice produced, distributed, and exchanged the knowledge of security threats through name lists, cards, files, periodical reports, among others, not only inside the Ottoman bureaucracy, but also internationally. My research on Ottoman passport practices reveals a state network on administrative offices, correspondences between these offices, both high-level bureaucrats, including ministers, and lower-level public officials, registers and personal identity documents, international passports, internal passports, photographs in administrative files, and identity documents. Not only the political decisions in high politics or law, but also everyday administrative decisions and regulations in daily life and basic paperwork created an administrative network that hung like a black cloud over the heads of the labeled. This administrative network consisted not only of administrative structure as offices, but of bureaucrats, bureaucratic correspondence, offices, documents, photographs, traditional social control mechanisms, and their actors. These labels were also created on the ground of securitization of political issues and used through the administrative network. Decisions taken in relation to security both rendered politics a technical matter and increased state intervention in daily life. The administrative network emerged as a pattern, a mentality, whose form can be traced in laws, regulations, council of state decisions, and the like. This network also reveals how implementation extended from the very top of the bureaucracy to its lowest levels, and how spatial and temporal differences and contradictions functioned within this network. The monitoring and controlling practices established by introducing regulations on passports and internal passports indicate how the Ottoman Empire broadened its scope of governance. The book provides an analysis of Ottoman passports in the global institutional history of state documentation. This approach makes it possible to place Ottoman passports within the global history and also opens a window to argue that considering the passport policies as an example of state administrative practices at the level of politics of security can illuminate the politics towards defined suspect groups. The legal framework also opens a legal space for exceptions that were mostly regulated not by laws, but by regulations and instructions in the Hamidin era. It's also evident that there is a similar perspective towards vagrancy, anarchism, and seasonal workers in Germany, France, and Austria-Hungary. Therefore, in the Ottoman context, there was a connection and overlap between the concepts of vagrant, anarchist, and conspirator, which was, Fesad, which was an Islamic concept, in discourse of the Ottoman bureaucracy. This book explores the ways in which the threat perceptions shape the security discourse of the political center. There is no doubt that state elites of this period saw the survival of the state as being under threat. This perception of danger also affected the language used in the state correspondence from the upper levels of government down to minor civil servants. The historical framework set out in the book demonstrates the historical and spatial stage established by this discourse. Answering such questions as who used this discourse or how it was used and in which positions helps in understanding the actors who took part in the discourse constructed along the axis of danger or threat and in comprehending the mentality which it was constituted. Thus, when attempting to understanding the roles of those who use the discourse of danger and how they position themselves, we must also seek to understand the place of groups constructed as the objects of discourse within the state's perception of threats and its security mentality. The book also discusses the discourse of the center and the ways in which the state read the relations between the fundamental actors. Analyzing the state's mentality through the discourse of the people, bureaucrats, who represented its institutions reveals how certain meanings and representational forms in the institutional political field dominated over others, and how the state made use of the discursive field in question to achieve its security aims. In light of the fact that the discursive reflection of the state's mentality was built on accumulation of knowledge, a key question we must ask is how the state classified and interpreted the information it held. One question of undeniable importance is whether through the discourse that the state constructed there existed a connection between the critical events of the era and the administrative political changes that took shape in those moments. The near articulations of Vagrant and Fesat, conspirator, created a discursive link to pejorative understanding of anarchism and anarchist in official correspondence. This security discourse also refers to the concepts of social order and the pan-Islamic discourse that the Hamidian regime disseminated to obtain legitimacy in the domestic and international spheres. It also refers to the security ideology, which dwells on the intention of unifying the empire against internal and external enemies. The aim of the book consists of examining the relation between these emerging threat perceptions of the political center by using discourse analysis and the new regulations on geographical mobilization. These discursive truths paved the way for the process of labeling through administrative practices. Labeling individuals, the administration deemed suspect. Considering the fact that these concepts had also legal meanings in the Ottoman criminal law, Vagrancy Act, passport codes, and their use in administration manifests how the Ottoman state defined who remained inside and outside its definition of citizenship. With the concurrent use of Ottoman Turkish archival sources, Ottoman passports, the book seeks answers to these questions by focusing on the systemic attempts on regulating the geographical mobility, which played a key role in facilitating security policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we'll have some questions from the room. Are you going to signal to me when we also have questions online?
Yeah. I also have the check-in thing.
Yeah. So we're going to. You're always supporting us by just putting your name on these things to help us prove that we're doing something useful. Yeah. So you want to field the questions here, and then we'll pipe up when there's something online.
Thank you for a fabulous talk. And it is very important to me because I always wondered when the minoritization of the Armenian community started in the Ottoman Empire. And obviously, 1850s onward seems to be that, in coming together with, that is when they are then marginalized, excluded, and eventually, when you were talking about those who weren't let back into the Ottoman Empire, I said, good, at least. Because then, of course, there was the Armenian genocide. I mean, and a lot of them were killed, as you know, massacred during that time, especially in Harpak. What I was interested in is the gender dimension. I mean, so because when you say seasonal workers and things like that, I mean, it's evident that these are male. I mean, all the officials, the bureaucracy is also all male. So how did they treat women? and children, I mean, or the elderly, were they seen as potential threats? Because, as you know, during the forced deportations, it was mostly the men and the sort of young young men, let's say, young adults, adult men, who were taken out and massacred, and they usually didn't do that to the women and children and the elderly. They instead, unfortunately, distributed them among Turkish and Kurdish nobles and everything.
Yeah,
That's my question.
thank you for the question. So first, I'll talk about a bit on regulation and then the practice. So according to the regulation, the passport code, and also the internal passport code, so a woman or a servant, like a jariye,
Concubine.
They need a reference to their husband or their father, or I don't know, their elderly brother, like, a male person. So they need this, and they need their permission if they needed their permission if they were traveling alone. But of course, as we saw in the Oznif's case, it was not always the case, no? So most of the women actually back then, they were, especially for the migration to the US, they were trying to meet up with their families, like, their husbands, sometimes their like sons, sometimes fathers. So they had to travel alone. And then they were asking for permission from their local communities, like, from the muhtar, I mean, the neighborhood heads, or, from the local church. And then they had to get another permission with that document. Like, it was like a reference letter, actually, to the administrative center. So they were asking another permission from the governorate and so on. So, all these papers. And, there were also the second part. There were also, of course, women revolutionaries.
Yeah.
And they were also filed as Pesat, or, conspirator. But I mean, in the beginning of this era, they were not considered as a vital threat. So they were, they were filed a bit differently than the male revolutionaries or male seasonal workers. But then, especially during and after the massacres, let's say like the second half of the 90s, we see that this approach changed, especially, when you look at archival documents, then you see that they were also considered as like, threat elements, as, I mean, like the male revolutionaries. So there's this turn in mid 1890s, I can say.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
I'm sorry, you were first.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the amazing lecture. I was curious whether you have looked at the other empires, because I see quite a lot of similarities between, for example, Russian Empire and Ottoman Empire in terms of passport regulations, and especially internal travel permits. And I was curious whether they borrowed from each other or they actually were influenced by other Western countries.
Yeah, actually, excellent question. Yes. So the Ottomans, I mean, both of them, they were land-based empires, and, the regulations about the internal passports or, internal travel permits, they were mostly connected to their land systems. So they were trying to, keep the peasants in the lands, to continue the agricultural production. So it was the basic understanding of this. And in that sense, they were really similar, the Russian case and the Ottoman case. And at the same time, when you look at this historical development of anarchist movements, especially the nihilist movement, it was also another turning point, and it was in Russia. No? And Ottoman Empire was really eager to learn what was Russia doing in the means of fighting against the internal threats, And also Europe was, trying to learn from the Russian experience. Also, they were a bit, how can I say, distanced in the mentality or the understanding of those regulations, but still. And yes, I read a lot about the Russian experience, especially how they created the intelligence offices, how they were trying to pursue the anarchists or revolutionaries and so on. And in Europe, in this conference of Rome, it was also the case. And Ottoman Empire, again, was very active in the means of knowledge exchange and also trying to find the best way to practice in the Ottoman lands. So they were actually like trying to learn, and so there were actually like two temporalities. One of them was the Ottoman temporality, there was this huge tradition of internal passports and also, the regulations about the external travels and so on. And they were using the old traditional techniques. But at the same time, there was this second temporality in the 19th century, Russia and Europe. So they were also eager to, to get together all those techniques and try to practice them all together. So yeah, there's a connection.
With one more question here, and then we'll have one online.
My question is kind of related to that one because I'm a historian of Russia. So I do also see many similarities between, the passport regimes of the two countries. But you told the story of the restriction of mobility, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's what's kind of counterintuitive to me because of the period you are studying, the late 19th century and early 20th century, because that's the age of great mobility, right? Both internally and internationally. For example, in Russia, there was this abolishment of serfdom, right? And also there was this population exchange between the Russian Empire and Ottoman Empire after the Caucasus War.
Mm-hmm.
So I just find it fascinating that at the same time, you have these economic imperatives to increase population mobility. And in the meantime, you also created regime to restrict mobility. So I don't know if you encounter this kind of conflict of the two imperatives in your study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like, that's true. I mean, it's also the age of new infrastructures, in the means of mobility. So steamships, railways, and so on. That's true. And I think it's also one of the most important factors that Ottomans were trying to push these travel regulations so hard. But it doesn't mean that they were always successful in that. So, even if they were trying to limit the mobility in a way for certain elements, like, for example, Italian workers, it was one of the biggest issues for the Ottoman Empire. On the one hand, those Italian workers, they were working in the railway constructions, in mines all over the empire. They needed that workforce. But on the other hand, they were trying to limit the entrance of the Italians because they were thinking that those Italians, they could be anarchists. There was this, assassination against the king of Umberto. Elizabeth, Sissi, she was also assassinated by an Italian. And there was this huge fear about the Italians, the mobile Italians. And they were actually deported in lots of countries in the Western Europe. But they mostly ended up in Ottoman Empire, although Ottoman Empire tried to prevent their mobility. But at the same time, we see these other regulations, like they were trying to check the workers' names, name lists with the Italian consulate, or I don't know, like with different consulates. They were trying to understand if those workers, they belong to a political party, especially, if they had in those networks of socialists or anarchists and so on. So yeah, they were actually, they were at the same time, like on the one hand, there was this huge mobility. But on the other hand, the empire itself was trying to limit this mobility, especially for some certain people.
So we have a question from our colleague Mansuni.
Hello.
Since you have two case studies, Armenians and Macedonians, how are they treated similarly or different? Did the views of one influence the views of the other, or was there a kind of police bureaucratic gaze on deviance? How effective were all these methods given the state's ambitions?
Yes, so actually now I'm also working in another, I mean, on another project, and it was also related, I mean, this question is also related to that one. So especially, after the Ottoman-Russian War, and finally, after the Berlin Treaty, I mean, before there was San Stefano Treaty, and there was this bigger, a bigger Bulgaria. And then with the San Stefano, the Bulgaria was the great powers, they interrupted, and then we had this, we see this like smaller Bulgaria, and Macedonia was an issue between Bulgaria, Ottoman Empire, and even with Greece after the Berlin Treaty. And for the Ottoman point of view, I mean, when you look at the archival documents, they were referring to what happened to Bulgaria as an autonomous principality after the war could happen to eastern provinces. And nearly in every document in the high-level bureaucracy about the Armenian question, I mean, during the Hamidin era, there was a reference to the Bulgarian issue, and then the Macedonian issue. So they were analyzing, or they were creating this knowledge about the eastern provinces through the Bulgarian case. And when you look at the documents, the passports, or internal permits, so Bulgaria was, or yeah, I mean, let's say, I mean, Macedonia was also a complicated issue because it was a part of it was also still under the sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire. So Ottoman Empire was trying to use the internal passports, but the Bulgarian government was trying to use the Bulgarian passport in both in Macedonia and also in Bulgaria, of course. So it created this, this conflict. And, especially for the peasants, the peasant mobility, because most of those people, they were working, in those transborder regions, like connected lands. So they were, although, for example, they were from Bulgaria or they were from Macedonia, they could just, go to work to the, quote unquote, to the Ottoman lands, or, to the, how can I say, more sovereign Ottoman lands anyways. And it became an issue for both sides. And they tried to regulate this mobility, but it also created another process of labeling the citizens of those states. So, and for the Bulgarian case, especially because of the internal Macedonian organization, the revolutionary committees, or the organizations, from the Ottoman point of view, or from the Ottoman governing elites, there was always this problem of every single Bulgarian peasant, or every single non-Muslim Macedonian peasant could be a revolutionary. So they were using those techniques again in the Macedonian case as well. But it was because of the geography and because of the political mobility of the Macedonians. It was quite different than the Armenian case. Maybe I can say the political mobility, I mean. And also the guerrilla tactics and so on. It was quite difficult. But then we also see different strategies, like, ordinary peasants, they were taking passports, sometimes internal passports from the Ottoman government, and they were giving those passports to the revolutionaries just, to secure their travels in a way. So, yeah.
Can I just follow up with one more question?
Sorry, yeah.
Okay.
That was another one before. Sorry.
Yeah. So let's take those and then I'll come back.
Okay.
So I was trying to, I can hear more from you about what was going on in the mind of the state to link mobility to potential revolution. Because, I mean, revolutionaries could be everywhere or anywhere. What about mobility in particular that they thought it was particularly needed to be controlled to that extent? And then I was also intrigued by your comment about the connection to the photography and security at the time, thinking about biometrics, where we are now. But if you go back to Marguerite's picture, the photographer is an Armenian photographer, right? And I'm just wondering, was there any kind of a control by the state on photography, or who could do photography for passports? Or I'm just projecting 21st century on the early 20th.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So the first question, yes, so the revolutionaries and mobility. So from the Ottoman state's point of view, it was not only the people, but the ideas. They were also mobile. Newspapers, they were also mobile. Revolutionary postcards, they were also mobile. So from my point of view, there's this connection between mobility, ideas, press, and people, like mobilities actually. And, you know, those new regulations or, you know, technologies of control the mobility. And for the Ottoman Empire, it was the biggest challenge. I mean, when you look at the archival documents, especially for, the high-level bureaucracy, that, you know, those revolutionaries, even if there was one revolutionary, it was still very dangerous because that person could go somewhere in the East, like, you know, and it was generally written like this. Sometimes they don't even mention the, you know, names or, you know, it's like hypothetical. So, you know, hypothetical, like, and, you know, that person could organize a network and, you know, could distribute his idea or her ideas. And then, you know, there was also arms smuggling going on. And then at some point, those people could get arms and then there could be a rebellion. But the main issue actually was Ottoman government was so weak that actually the, you know, the high-level bureaucracy, lower ranks of bureaucracy, the army, they could not control, they could not actually control the borders regularly. And it was also an issue of security for them. So instead of solving these infrastructural problems, you know, it was easier to label some people and then, you know, to create this understanding of danger, threat, security. Because, you know, when you look at when you look what was happening before the Sassoon massacre, there was, you know, even in the Ottoman documents, they were talking about revolutionaries and revolutionary threat and blah, blah. But they also knew, you know, that it was not a reality. And even after the Sassoon massacre, you know, it was written as a Sassoon rebellion by the, you know, by the Ottoman Commission and so on. But actually they knew that it was not a rebellion. It was a self-defense, and it was a problem of double taxation and, you know, the regular attacks of some certain Kurdish tribes. But still, you know, they were pursuing this understanding and this discourse, and then they were pushing those different kinds of security mechanisms and regulations. And the second question, yes. So, I mean, for the photography, actually, I really like to talk about photography in the sense. So in like late 19th century, we see those new developments in Europe, especially in France, about the police photographs like porte-parle or, you know, the Bertillon method. So it was actually how can I say, it was the history of today's biometrics in a way. So they were taking the photographs of the criminals or sometimes suspects, and they were like measuring some certain physical physical organs, and, you know, they were writing down the physical appearances and so on. So it was, but there was a standard of Bertillonage. And the Ottoman government actually, again, they were really eager to learn about it. So before the Conference of Rome, they sent some high-level police officers to learn about this to France. And they learned about it. And then they ordered the related technology because they needed some certain kinds of photograph machines and also some certain kinds of measurements technologies and so on. So they ordered them and they planned to educate the Ottoman police officers. And actually they did, in the long term they did it. But then, you know, it was again too expensive to do it in all over the empire. So it was in Istanbul. They also, you know, tried to do it in Izmir, in Beirut, you know, some port cities. And especially, you know, with the ban and also with this new regulation about the photographs, it was a huge crisis because, I mean, they didn't have enough police officers who were educated as photographers. they didn't have the equipments in most of the places. So they just left people to take their own photographs from like civil photographers. And, as in this one, there was no regulation, it was, and in some certain cases, they were bringing their, let's see, the family photographs. So it was not even aimed to be put in a police file. They were just, coming with their family photographs from home. And in the Ottoman archives, so there were actually like 2-3 different kinds of classifications. Some of them were under the photograph files. So there is another section in the Ottoman archives just called photography. Some of them, they were under the section of the foreign affairs. Some of them, they were under the section of interior ministry, the reform commission, which was mainly working on the eastern provinces. So, they were all spread around different classifications and so on. But yes, so I mean, the thing is, like, although the Ottoman Empire was one of the first states who used photography to control the geographic mobility, there was no standardization. But when you check the European examples, actually, like, until the end of the century, it was the same. They were trying to use this Bertillon technique, but most of the countries, they did not use it. It was too expensive. It needed a special kind of expertise. So they tried it on and off in different countries, but it didn't end, but there was a shift after the Scotland Yard found the fingerprint technologies. So.
We had a question here, and then I have two. Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation. Something I was particularly interested in was just as you were talking about the rapid expansion of the Ottoman security apparatus and what that meant for the bureaucracy and the administration. And really, I think the anecdote you gave about like people having to be trained to take photographs kind of illustrates how these practices, while effective, showcase the limits of the administrators and how technology and how training, it was dispensed, but there were limitations on that. So my question for you is, did you see other examples of this where these policies, while effective, still had limitations and how bureaucrats or administrators were capable of performing them?
You mean in the Ottoman Empire, in
Yes.
other cases, or in Europe?
In Ottoman Empire.
In the Ottoman Empire. So the Armenian community, it was the second target, maybe I can say. The first target were the seasonal workers and the labeled anarchists. So after the Conference of Rome, actually it started before the Conference of Rome, but with the Conference of Rome, it became structured that, these different empires, including the Ottoman Empire, they were sending the the name list of the anarchists with their photographs. And they were sending it to different centers. There was this long-term mobility of photographs in the means of police photographs between Belgium and Ottoman Empire. Like in every 3 months, they were sending photographs and so on with the name lists. And for the Ottoman Empire, they were, if there were enough copies, they were sending those photographs to the ports commissions. But of course, it's the tricky part. Like in prison photography, I think it's the same thing. Like you have those archives of photographs, like, I don't know, maybe thousands of photographs. You were circulating those photographs, inside the empire. But then who would check? So there was this huge, how can I say, huge information, or, they created those huge information hubs, especially in the ports. But then there was this problem. Then who would check, who would control those photographs? I don't know how they were filing them, according to the name lists or according to the lists of the locals, like, the village, the belongings, or, then yes, but yes, so there was the other case was the seasonal workers and the anarchists or, socialists.
So let me just post those together. The first one we have partially answered, but I do the justice. So the first one is from Ernie King. How well secured were the borders, and to what extent could a person travel, move, and live without proper documents? And the second one from Professor Barbarian. Who says, I'm sorry if you talked about this and I missed it. How did the Ottoman state deal with forged passports? Many of the revolutionaries circulated using forged passports and fake names. I'm thinking of revolutionaries like the ARF, leaders Christopher Mikhailian, traveling as a Jewish merchant, Samuel Klein and Dubina, or Sophia Areshian, both masterminds behind the attempted assassination of Sultan Abdul Hamid, traveling as his daughter.
Yeah. So the first one, the borders, they were not secure. The short answer is, yes, after 1890s, the Ottoman government, they were trying to create this border regulations and border infrastructure, especially, with the eastern borders, also in the western borders, but eastern borders were, anyways, they prioritized it. And there were these ongoing negotiations with the Russian government, but there were two different, problems. One of them was the political problem, that they could not have the same understanding of the border security in a way. And the second one was the problems of infrastructure and budget. So on the one hand, the Ottoman Empire, it was basically bankrupt. So it declared the bankruptcy just before this. In late 70s, early 80s, and there was no budget for this kind of creating this kind of infrastructure. And the Ottoman government also could not pay the salaries of the army officers or the police officers during that time. So it also created another dimension. And although there were plans, especially the Reform Commission after 95-96, there was a Reform Commission in that area in the eastern provinces. Although, we saw, I saw those proposals from the Inspector General, they could not manage to realize those things. So but still, there were like irregular checks. And if an ordinary peasant, if you caught in an irregular check, then, you had a big problem with the police or, with the local authorities. It was the same in the Bulgarian border or in Macedonia, let's say, the connected regions, I can say. And in those regions, actually, the Bulgarian government was harsher than the Ottoman Empire. They were just, shooting at people and killing people. It was the ordinary peasants. We also see it in the East. So, but yeah, it was a bit different, I think, in the Bulgarian case. And the other question was
about forged passports.
Forged, yeah. Yes, of course, there were a lot of forgery. So, when you look at the Ottoman archives, there were a lot of decrees about, eliminating the forgery, which means there was forgery. But at the end, they could not. So the authenticity of the documents, or, to understand the authenticity of the documents was quite difficult. And especially a lot of Ottoman officers, they could not read or write. So it was also another issue. That's why, for the Bulgarian peasants, it was quite easy to give their passports to the revolutionaries. And yes, that case that she mentioned, it's a perfect case. The assassination attempt to Abdülhamit II. They tried to find Samuel Fein, as far as I remember the name, Samuel Fein, and there were so many investigation files about him, like, where did he stay, in what hotel, in which name, at the end, at the end of this whole investigation file about the assassination of the Ottoman file I'm talking about, they could not find it out. Like, although it's also interesting, like, although of course, in IRF circles, as far as I remember from her writings, of course, everyone knew him, like, in a way. But yeah, for the Ottomans, no. Yeah, who was first? I'm sorry. Yeah, anyways, yeah.
In recent economic historians have been looking at the migration networks especially in the US context. So one of the findings was that when you have an influx of immigrants to a community, they provide support for the newcomers, the latecomers, and create a network of like help them find jobs, refer them to jobs, help house them in some cases. Has there been any inquiry into the case of the migrants from the Ottoman Empire, especially the Armenian migrants? You mentioned that they were barred from traveling to US, but before that period and after the ban has been imposed.
Yeah, especially for the US, I mean the Armenian community in US, yes, they had those solidarity networks, and especially they had the family networks. And as far as I understand from the files about smuggling, the human smuggling, they were also connected those, human smuggling networks, especially for their family members or also the members of their local communities and so on. Yes, so yes.
Is there another question?
Yeah, that was the one, and then yours.
And then I have one.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. And I was just curious, kind of piggybacking off Rudy's question. What do we know about how different Armenian or Bulgarian communities reacted to these passport regimes? Did they push back against them in some way, maybe by forging documents? Did they try to share information with their communities about how to navigate, this kind of system successfully? What's on the other side?
Yeah. I mean, on the other side, yeah. I mean, we talked about it a bit, like the 4G. Yes, 4G was an issue. Another thing was like, I mean, it was not only the political issue, but also how can I say, it was a huge work, and also it was expensive for the ordinary people to go to the city center or, the town center to get the real papers. They also had to, pay some fees, and so unless they were workers. So workers, they had some special regulations about the workers, but anyways. So what they were trying to do is actually they were trying to push this like old social control mechanisms, like the Sureti system, or the local community leaders. So they were trying to travel with I mean, it's called İlmu Haber in Ottoman Turkish, but it's like a reference or a certificate of good behavior of the person. So, they were taking this document, for example, from the local community church, and then, they were trying to travel with this document instead of taking for example, internal passport or an international passport. So, and most of them, they didn't have IDs. Like Tezkere-i Osmani, because it also, it's like, again, it was the same issue, like you had to travel to the town center or the city center, and then you had to pay a fee and so on. So instead of, doing those, they were like trying to navigate through the old kind of, because İlmu Haber itself, actually, it was coming from the old traditional mechanism of Ottoman social control. So it was how can I say, transformed or reformed way of this traditional social control mechanisms in a way. So they were doing it, or they were trying to find a guarantor in, for example, in a big city like Istanbul or Smyrna. So it was also part of the red tide, by the way. They should, but they were just trying to create like another parallel system, just to eliminate those regulations and so on. And also the smuggling, of course. Sorry.
I want to know about reasons for returning.
he told that there were ships full of Armenians that want to return to the Ottoman Empire. So despite the fact that it was really hard to leave the empire and many Armenians just escaped from massacres. Maybe there's some information of why some of them wanted to return. I think that, yes, then some of them would be revolutionaries, but what about the others? Why?
I don't know. But then I will, because I looked at memoirs, so I was able to, what they would do usually is that there were these, if you look at the beginning of industrialization in the United States, it starts on the East Coast and they have like little factories and manufacturing nodes, and that's where they would work. So it would usually be young men, I mean, you know, who were adults. They would go there, work at those factories, make a lot of money, and then they would bring the money back and buy land, you know, so, or, and find a wife and sort of, so it was seen literally as a source of income, very similar to how things are even today. You know, that's why, that's how they would, it was mostly for monetary reasons, that they wouldn't settle there, they would send money back or come back with the money and buy land. And of course, I know that because with that 1915, or the Kurds or Turkish officials basically took those lands from the Armenians and killed them.
And maybe another reason was, you know, after the massacres, during and after the massacres, a lot of, I mean, like hundreds, thousands of Armenians, they left the Ottoman Empire. But you know, then there was this memorandum, the European memorandum of 96. And it was not only the right of return, it was also about the advancing the conditions and, you know, security of the Armenian community in the region. So actually it created some kind of a hope, as far as I understand. And of course, you know, those people in the very beginning, they didn't have the imagination of, or, you know, they didn't plan to leave. Like they were just trying to survive in a way. Not all of them, but as far as I understand, most of them. I'm talking about the ones who migrated to Russia and Mediterranean coasts. And then, you know, after the memorandum, and of course, after the amnesty, they wanted to come back. And of course, some of them, they also had land and homes, and also some families remained there. So they wanted to go back to their own, you know, their Heimat. Heimat is the German homelands. Or, yeah. I think, but yeah, I mean, it's also.
So then let me post this one and then probably we should let our guest off the hook. So thank you so much for the presentation. My question is regarding Ottoman state policies vis-a-vis passports in Mount Lebanon, another autonomous province in the Ottoman Empire and Balkans. Can we find parallels or differences?
Yeah, it's there are some works on it. Unfortunately I don't know much about them. I mean the practices in Lebanon, but what I know is or you know from the archival documents. So back then, yeah, Lebanon, I mean the condition or the political condition or the structure in Lebanon was quite different than what was happening in other provinces in the Ottoman Empire. But the thing is, like, they were using the Ottoman system, even if the, how can I say, the French and the British were involved, and, you know, they created this different political or local political structures there. So it was still the internal passport and also the international passport. But then another question was about the local belonging and also the citizenship regimes. That was the complicated, as far as I remember, that was the complicated part about the Lebanese case. But interestingly, when you look at the Armenian case and, you know, the connection of Lebanon or Beirut, it was interesting when you look at all these, you know, mobility waves or, you know, migration waves, although the mobility of Armenians were seen as like, you know, or conceptualized or defined as like a threat itself, their migration to Lebanon was something that were considered as a positive a positive, I mean, instead of a problem, a positive event or a moment for the Armenian question. So actually the Ottoman government, because, you know, I talked about this Trabzon case. Do you remember that, you know, during the famine, a lot of people, they were moving to Trabzon to go to different places and so on. So there was a similar case for Beirut, for Lebanon. They were also like, you know, from the eastern provinces, some people, they were going to Trabzon to the north, to the Black Sea coast. Some of them, they were going to Mersin, to the southern coast, Mediterranean. And from Mersin, they were trying to go to Beirut. And, you know, when you compare those two cases, the Ottoman government, I mean, in the correspondence, it was like that, quote, after the security tests were checked, something like that in the Ottoman Turkish, end quote, they decided that their migration to Beirut was actually quite a good thing for the Ottoman government. So they just wanted to move I mean, not all the Armenian community, of course, but they just wanted to make it easier for the Armenian community to move to Beirut, to the Eastern Mediterranean, in a way. So, yes, but yeah, I'm not an expert on the Lebanese case, and yes.
Thank you so much.